The Senate chamber fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked to the witness table, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, her natural hair styled in a sleek bob that caught the overhead lights. The 33-year-old former public defender from Texas had been called to testify about voting rights legislation, but what happened next would shock the entire nation. Senator Lindsey Graham sat at the committee table, his face already flushed, red hands gripping a stack of papers like weapons the South. Carolina Republican had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the hearing, and everyone in the room could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. Miss Crockett Graham's voice cracked through the microphone, his southern drawl thick with barely contained rage. "You Democrats think you can just waltz in here and lecture us about democracy while you're trying to destroy the room." Erupted camera flashes went off like lightning strikes. Crockett didn't flinch, she simply adjusted. Her microphone looked directly into Graham's eyes and smiled. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform, turning a routine Senate hearing into the political moment of the year. Graham thought he could intimidate the young black congresswoman from Texas. He was dead wrong to understand why this confrontation was so explosive. You need to know who these two political figures really are and what brought them to this boiling point. The South Carolina Republican built his career as a sharp-tongued attack dog, never afraid to raise his voice or throw political punches. He survived countless political battles, from impeachment trials to Supreme Court confirmations. Graham sees himself as a guardian of traditional Senate decorum, which in his mind means young Democrats should show proper respect to their elders. But Graham had been having a rough year. His approval ratings back home were slipping. Younger Republicans were calling him a Rhino Republican in name only, and the Trump base that once loved him was turning cold. He needed a moment to prove he was still a fighter. They remembered on the other side of the chamber sat Jasmine Crockett, and she couldn't have been more different at 33. She's part of a new generation of Democratic leaders who refused to play by the old rules before Congress. Crockett was a civil rights attorney and public defender in Dallas, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She didn't come to Washington to make friends or follow traditions. She came to get things done. Crockett had already made waves in her short time in Congress. She'd gone viral multiple times for her sharp questioning during committee hearings. Unlike older Democrats who often try to find compromise, Crockett believed in fighting fire with fire. Her motto was simple: respect is earned, not given based on age or seniority. The legislation they were discussing would determine whether millions of Americans, particularly in communities of color, would have their voting access protected or restricted. For Graham, this was about preserving what he called election integrity. For Crockett, it was about protecting democracy itself. The hearing had been tense all morning. Republican senators had been aggressive with Democratic witnesses, interrupting them, cutting off their answers, and making snide comments under their breath. Crockett had watched it all, taking. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, taking notes, waiting for her turn while the tension in the Senate chamber thickened with every passing minute. Senator Graham had already raised his voice at two other witnesses, pounded his fist on the table, and thrown out several comments that left Democratic senators shaking their heads. At cameras loved it. Graham relished playing the angry conservative defender, standing tall against what he described as woke Democrats trying to federalize our elections. But Graham had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the young woman from Texas who was about to take the microphone. There was history between them 6 months earlier during a House Judiciary Committee hearing. Crockett had dismantled a witness that Graham himself had recommended. Her line of questioning was so sharp it completely unraveled Graham's narrative about voter fraud, infuriating him in the process. He dismissed her questions as gotcha politics and showboating, and since then he'd made repeated jabs about young Democrats who didn't understand how Washington works. He never named her, but everyone in the political world knew exactly who he meant. Insiders had been waiting for this moment to direct face-off. Crockett had been preparing. She studied Graham's style, watched countless hours of his hearings, and rehearsed her counterpoints with precision. That morning, she told her staff, "If Senator Graham wants to bring the heat, I'm ready to show him what Texas heat really feels like." The moment had arrived. The veteran senator, who believed his seniority and volume could overpower anyone, versus the young congresswoman who built her reputation standing up to bullies in Texas courtrooms. The room felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. Graham was already in full attack mode, his voice louder with each witness, his tone more accusatory than inquisitive. Congresswoman Crockett Graham said, his voice slick with sarcasm as he shuffled his papers, "You've been quite vocal about this voting rights legislation. Tell me, In your vast experience, how exactly do you justify federal interference in state election laws? Crockett leaned forward, her hands calmly folded. Senator Graham, I appreciate the question. Federal oversight of voting rights isn't interference. It's constitutional protection, the 15th Amendment. Before she could continue, Graham cut in his voice, rising. Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady. I was studying constitutional law when you were in elementary school. The room stirred Democratic. Senators shifted. Republican staffers behind Graham exchanged uncertain glances. This was escalating quickly. Crockett held her composure. Senator, with respect, the Constitution doesn't have an expiration date based on when someone learned the principles are the same, whether you studied them in 1985 or in 2015. Her voice was firm. Steady. Graham sneered. You Democrats come in here with your talking points and viral video moments, but you don't understand the real-world consequences of what you're proposing. He stood from his chair, a calculated move to physically dominate the exchange. At 6 feet tall, he towered over the seated Crockett. These election laws you want to overturn were passed by democratically elected state legislatures. But I guess democracy only counts when it goes your way. Right. The camera zoomed in. Graham's face was flushed, a vein visible on his forehead. His jaw clenched. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The only sign she was calculating her next strike. Senator Graham, she began evenly, I notice you keep mentioning democracy. Can you explain to me how making it harder for people to vote strengthens democracy? That's not what we're doing. Graham shot back, his voice echoing, we're protecting election integrity. But you wouldn't understand that because all you care about is what Crockett cut in sharply. All I care about is what Graham had walked right into it. Political observers could see it happen in real time. He was so angry, so desperate to dominate, that he didn't realize he was cornering himself. All you care about is playing the victim. Graham erupted, coming in here. Want us to make it easier to cheat. You want to eliminate voter ID, eliminate signature verification, eliminate every safeguard. We have Senator Crockett's expression never change. Her voice remained calm, but there was still underneath now as she spoke with precision and unwavering control. Are you suggesting that I personally want to make it easier to cheat in elections? Graham tried to recover. I'm saying you Democrats, no, sir. Crockett cut him off firmly. You said you pointed at me. You said I want to make it easier to cheat. Are you accusing me personally of wanting to facilitate election fraud? The room went dead silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment. Graham realized he'd stepped too far, but his pride refused to let him back down. I'm saying your policies, he stammered, but Crockett's voice rose for first time, sharp and commanding. Senator Graham, I'm a former prosecutor. I know the difference between discussing policies and making personal accusations. Which one are you doing right now? The air in the chamber tightened like a rope pulled taut. This was a moment everything shifted. Graham backed into a rhetorical corner. By his own words, chose the worst path possible. He doubled down. You know what? Graham shouted, his voice cracking with rage. I'm tired of being lectured by people who think being young and loud makes them right. I've been fighting for conservative principles since before you were born. He was pacing now, his hands waving wildly, papers scattered across the table. The microphone caught every breath, every tremor in his voice. You come to Washington thinking you can change everything, but you don't know how anything works. You're just another social media politician chasing your next viral moment. The committee chairman, a Republican from Iowa, looked visibly uncomfortable, leaning toward his aide, whispering urgently. Other Republican senators checked their phones, already seeing the clips being shared with captions like Graham meltdown and Senator loses it. Graham whirled around when the chairman tried to intervene. I'm not done. He bellowed. These young Democrats think they can disrespect this institution, disrespect senators who've been here for decades, and we're just supposed to sit here and take it. His face was now bright red, sweat glistening under the harsh committee lights. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as he turned back to Crockett, pointing his finger directly at her in a gesture that would soon be analyzed frame by frame on every platform. I won't take it, not from you, not from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not from any of you. This is a United States Senate, not some college debate club. Through the entire tirade, Crockett sat still, her posture unbroken, her expression calm, her hands folded like a defense attorney who had just watched the prosecutor implode in front of the jury. The visual contrast was powerful. Graham red-faced and shouting, Crockett composed and razor-sharp. Everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something historic. When Graham finally slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, the silence was so deep the hum of the air conditioning filled the void. All eyes turned to Crockett, waiting for her response. She took a slow sip of water, adjusted her microphone, and met Graham's eyes with the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Are you finished, Senator? She asked quietly. The question struck the room like a gavel. Graham Still trying to steady his breath, gave a curt nod. Good, Crockett said, her voice now steady and rising in strength. Because now it's my turn. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Everyone present, senators, staffers, journalists, and a national audience watching live, waited to see what Jasmine Crockett would say. Next, she took another sip of water, placed the glass down with careful precision, and locked eyes with Graham. Once more, when she spoke, her voice was deliberate, measured, and devastatingly effective, because you've just proven every point I came here to make about why we need federal voting rights protections. Graham began to interrupt, but Crockett calmly held up one finger, a gesture so deliberate and commanding that it stopped mid-sentence. No, sir, you had your time to speak uninterrupted for quite a while. Actually, now it's my turn, and I'm going to use my time more efficiently than you use yours. The room felt electric. Even Republican senators leaned forward, sensing that something rare was unfolding. You said I'm young and loud. Senator Graham, you're right about one thing. I am young. I'm 33 years old. But loud, sir, I haven't raised my voice once during this entire exchange. You, on the other hand, she gestured toward him with a subtle smile. Well, I think the record speaks for itself. Quiet chuckles rippled to the chamber. Graham's face remained red, but now the flush came from embarrassment rather than fury. You also said, I don't understand how things work in Washington. Let me tell you what I understand. Senator, I understand that for far too long the way things work in Washington has been that when powerful men don't like what they're hearing, they raise their voices, and hope volume can substitute for substance. She let that hang in the air. I understand that the way things work means that when young women, especially young women of color, ask hard questions, they're called disrespectful instead of getting real answers. But since you brought up constitutional law, Senator Graham, let's talk about that. You said you were studying the Constitution when I was in elementary school. That's probably true. I would have been about 8 years old when you first came to Congress. And she paused as Graham shifted, uncomfortably sensing what was coming. But here's what's interesting, Senator. In all those years you've been studying constitutional law, did you ever stop at the 15th Amendment, the one that says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude? She calmly opened a folder. Because I have here the voting records from your state of South Carolina, and the data shows that in counties with higher black populations, voters are significantly more likely to face longer wait times, fewer polling places per capita, and stricter ID requirements. Now, as someone who's been studying constitutional law for so long, how do you reconcile that with the 15th Amendment? Graham opened his mouth, but Crockett wasn't finished. You know what else I understand about how things work in Washington? I understand that some people think that just because they've been here longer, their opinions matter more. But let me tell you something about my background, since you seem so curious about my qualifications. Her voice was growing stronger, more impassioned, but never loud. Before I came to Congress, I was a public defender in Dallas County, Texas. Do you know what that means, Senator Graham? It means I spent my days fighting for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. I represented clients facing the full power of the state with nothing but an overworked lawyer standing between them and a prison sentence. She leaned forward slightly. I've stood in courtrooms where prosecutors try to intimidate me with their volume, their experience, their connections. I've stood before judges who believe a young black woman had no business challenging their authority. And you know what I learned, Senator? I learned that when someone starts yelling instead of answering questions, usually means they don't have good answers. But let's talk about facts instead of feelings, shall we, Crockett?